Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Chapter 8 in our Problems in International Politics lectures. We will tackle today a somehow delicate topic, the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict. And the question that I ask is in the subtitle of today's chapter: is it a never-ending hostility? Is it a never-ending enmity? 3 weeks ago, on October 14, the Israeli government authorized the construction of 2,166 new housing units in the West Bank for Israeli settlers. 2020 thus is the biggest year since 2012 in terms of the construction of new settlements by the Israeli in the Palestinian territory, or supposedly Palestinian territory of the West Bank. And of course, the Israeli government, more specifically Netanyahu, the prime minister, profited. In doing so, he profited from Donald Trump's announcements made 1 year ago in December 2019, when Trump said that the US would no longer consider Israeli settlements in the West Bank to be illegal under international law. This was one of Donald Trump's unilateral announcements and decisions that we had a look at, that we referred to in our chapter 3, dealing with Trump's unilateralism more precisely. Trump's announcement 1 year ago was but the latest decision of the Trump administration, overturning long-held US positions on several of the Israeli-Palestinians' most contentious issues, of course, to the dismay of the Palestinians, the Palestinian leaders, be it the Fatah controlling politically the West Bank, or the Hamas, all the more so, controlling the Gaza Strip. Two major unilateral decisions by Trump in January 2020. Trump proposed his Middle East plan, his new Middle East plan, which puts forward the two-state solution, but which is considered by those who criticize this plan, both among Palestinians in the Arab world, more generally among some Western allies, and of course within the US by political opponents to Trump, which is considered by these criticism as a kind of smokescreen for the annexation of the West Bank. And 3 years ago, on December 6, 2017, Trump had announced that Jerusalem, the US would recognize Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. The US embassy did indeed move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in May 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, let's listen to Donald Trump justifying, presenting his Middle East plan in presence of Netanyahu at the beginning of 2020, and justifying the different decisions that he took regarding the Israeli-Arab conflict and America's support in favor of Israel.
We will form a joint committee with Israel to convert the conceptual map into a more detailed and calibrated rendering so that recognition can be immediately achieved. We will also work to create a contiguous territory within the future Palestinian state for when the conditions for statehood are met, including the firm rejection of terrorism. Under this vision, Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided, very important, undivided capital. But that's no big deal because I've already done that for you, right? We've already done that, but that's okay. It's going to remain that way. And the United States will recognize Israeli sovereignty over the territory that my vision provides to be part of the state of Israel. Very important. And crucially, the proposed transition to a two-state solution will present no incremental security risk to the state of Israel whatsoever. We will not allow a return to the days of bloodshed, bus bombings, nightclub attacks, and relentless terror. Won't be allowed. Peace requires compromise, but we will never ask Israel to compromise its security. Can't do that.
We have already done that for you. I have already done that for you explicitly. Trump here expresses America's support for Netanyahu's policy. Anyway, to have an idea of the map of the two states as imagined, as conceived in this conceptual map of the Middle East plan proposed by Trump, have a look, please, on map number 7 that you can find on the file, in the file on Moodle. Trump justifies the different decisions that he took since 2017 by emphasizing the fact that policies that had been adopted in the past did not promote peace, and this obviously is the case. We can criticize Trump, but he's right when saying that all the policies adopted up to now did not permit peace to prevail among Israelis and Palestinians. And whatever the impact of his own decisions, of course, on this conflict, whatever the progress or not of his unilateral actions, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict indeed looks like a never-ending hostility, never-ending conflict opposing the Israeli to the Palestinians, and to some extent at least, this was more true for the past, come back to this, to some extent also opposing Israel to its various Arab neighbors. Conflict, and maybe should I say armed conflicts, because very recurrently, very regularly, armed violence is used by both protagonists, the Israelis on the one hand, the Palestinians and or the Arabs on the other hand. So let's have a look at the major stages of this Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict. And let's start with the strictly defined Israeli-Palestinian relationship. If we go back in time, the most significant episodes, if we go progressively back in time, the first operation, the first armed confrontation that we must emphasize is Operation Protective Edge. This is the name given to it by the Israeli Defense Forces. Operation Protective Edge waged by Israeli army against Hamas in Gaza during the summer 2014. This operation, which caused the death of more than 2,200 people in Gaza, including 600 children. This operation was triggered by the kidnapping and the killing of 3 Israeli teenagers. And the Israeli government, it was already Prime Minister Netanyahu, accused Hamas of being guilty of the kidnapping and the killing of these 3 teenagers. Netanyahu himself is reported, to have said they were killed, the 3 teenagers, they were killed, I quote, they were murdered in cold blood by human animals. So he considers members of the Hamas who killed the 3 teenagers to be human animals. Listen to this video, which sums up the event.
The bodies of 3 Israeli teens who went missing in the West Bank several weeks ago have been found. Israeli Defense Forces announced Monday that Gilad Sher, Naftali Frankel, and Eyal Ifrah were found dead on the outskirts of Hebron. The three teenagers disappeared while hitchhiking near that area on June 12th. Following the disappearance, Israel launched an intensive manhunt throughout the West Bank to find the missing boys. Over 400 Palestinians were arrested as security threats, and 5 people were killed during the operation. Israel's security service claims 2 Palestinian men working for Hamas abducted the 3 boys. The militant Palestinian organization has taken credit for similar kidnappings and murders in the past, but has not confirmed or denied responsibility in this case. The incident has inflamed tensions between Hamas and Israel. Earlier this week, the IDF and Hamas exchanged rocket and missile fire for the first time since 2012. And the discovery of 3 bodies is unlikely to ease those tensions. The Jerusalem Post reports Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the Security Cabinet Monday the boys were kidnapped and murdered in cold blood by animals. Hamas is responsible and Hamas will pay. It's also expected to put political pressure on Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who has publicly condemned the kidnapping. His Fatah government signed a controversial unity deal with Hamas 2 months ago.
It's one thing for him to condemn terrorism. It's another thing for him to sit in a government with a bunch of terrorists. He has to choose peace with Israel or pact with Hamas. He can't have both.
The IDF says it's still searching for the 2 suspects believed to have kidnapped the teens. A Hamas spokesperson denied all Israeli accusations against the group and warned the group would defend itself against any assault by Israel. For Newsiam, Zach Toombs.
This Operation Protective Edge 2014 was preceded by Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. More than 250 Palestinians were killed, and Operation Pillar of Defense was preceded by Operation Cast Lead in December 2008, January 2009. During this operation, 1,400 Palestinians, roughly, of course, statistics are not completely consensual, 1,400 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. These are the 3 direct military interventions of Israel against Hamas in Gaza were preceded by the 2 Intifada uprisings, the 2 Intifada movements in the Palestinian territories, both Gaza and above all the West Bank. The first Intifada from 1987 to 1993, and the second Intifada from 2000 to 2006. These 2 uprisings were different. During the first one, the Palestinians used the stones. Therefore, Intifada means sometimes is designated as the revolt of the stones against Israeli soldiers. The second one was much bloodier, with a lot of suicide attacks by Palestinian who accepted to commit suicide, to die in order to kill Israeli populations or Israeli soldiers. The first Intifada, ladies and gentlemen, was the indirect, in 1987, was the indirect consequence of another military operation of the Israelis against the Palestinians, the then PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, that had taken place in 1982. I was a student at that time, in the south of Lebanon, because in the south of Lebanon, the Palestinians had settled down after having been expelled from Jordan. Palestinian activists, the members of the PLO, they had settled in the south of Lebanon in order to bomb Israeli territory from Lebanon, the south of Lebanon, which is north of the Israeli territory, of course. And this operation, this operation called Peaceful Galilee, 1982, had ended with Arafat's expulsion from Lebanon. Arafat was the then leader of the PLO. He had to flee Beirut. He could flee Beirut thanks to a French ship, which took him to Tunis, the city of Tunis, capital of Tunisia, where the PLO's new headquarters were established, very far away from the Palestinian territory of Israel, according to the different perspectives, of course. And this explains that the Palestinians living in the occupied territories or in the West Bank, in the Gaza, in 1987 started this first Intifada, which was succeeded by a second one in 2006. We'll come back to this a little bit later in this chapter. So Israeli had intervened in Israeli Defense Forces had intervened in 1982 against the PLO in South Lebanon because of the PLO staging various attacks, including terrorist attacks against Israel, which amounts to saying that during the 70s and the second half of the 60s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was created in 1964, that is to say 15 years after Israel's creation in 1948, 1949. And during the years from 64 to 1982, the Palestinian strategy consisted in attacking Israel through terrorist attacks. Notably, the Palestinians, the various Palestinian groups, part or not of the PLO, skyjacked Israeli airplanes. They launched terrorist attacks against the Palestinian against Israeli territory, or also against Israelis in the world, notably the terrorist attack of the Olympic Games in 1972 in Munich, where a dozen of Israeli athletes were killed by a group which called himself Black September, in allusion to what happened in September 1970, when the Palestinian activists were expelled from Jordan, where they had settled down during the first years following Israelis' creation in 1948, 1949. So terrorist attacks, and these terrorist attacks turned into suicide attacks when Islamic and no longer secular Palestinian activists staged attacks against Israel. Of course, Israel replies, therefore it is a never-ending armed confrontation. Israel replied ever since the 1960s, 1970s. It replies nowadays with targeted killings of Palestinian leaders, with air bombing campaigns, the three ones that I mentioned. It uses the most developed weapons. Drones first were invented and used by Israeli Defense Forces, not necessarily against Palestinians, also to see, to control what the Syrian army was doing in the Golan Heights, close to the Golan Heights, etc., etc. It used and it still uses drones, other precision-guided smart weapons to eliminate Palestinian leaders or Palestinian terrorists. Of course, we should not forget that Israel also has been erected since the Second Intifada a security barrier, security fence, a separation barrier. You can call it as you like it. Of course, terms are hardly neutral and cannot be neutral when talking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel has been building the security barrier within the territory of the West Bank in order to protect the different Israeli settlements. By doing so, Israel, of course, decreases the territory available to the Palestinians themselves. Nowadays, more than 450,000 Jewish settlers are living in the West Bank, called occupied territories by the Palestinians. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, this strictly narrowly defined Israeli-Palestinian relationship can hardly be separated from the broader Israeli-Arab relationship. So let's have a look at the relationships, the evolution over time of the relationship between the Israelis and its various Arab neighboring states. This relationship was anything but peaceful too. Since 1948, the creation of Israel, 4 major wars opposed Israel, interstate wars, strictly defined, opposed Israel to its Arab neighbors, notably Egypt and Syria, and to some extent, Jordan. 4 interstate wars. The first one, 48-49, when Israel became independent, when Israel was created, was attacked by the different Arab states. There was no Palestinian group yet. So 1948, 1949. In 1956, the Suez Crisis, due to the then Egyptian leader Colonel Nasser's decision to nationalize the British, Franco-British Suez Canal Company, was the opportunity for Israel to attack Egypt. So the Second War in 1967 broke out, the 6 Days War, opposing notably the Israeli Defense Forces to Egypt and to Syria. This 6 Days War permitted Israel to very significantly enlarge its territory, to control the West Bank, to control Gaza, plus the Golan Heights, Syrian territory, plus the Sinai Peninsula in Egyptian territory, to control also the whole city of Jerusalem. And in 1973, the last direct war opposing Israel to an Arab state, the 1973 October or Kippur War. Kippur War is the term used by the Israelis. October War is the term used by the Arabs. And we should add to these 4 Israeli-Arab wars a 5th one, which did not oppose Israel to an Arab state, but Israel to a non-state entity, the Hezbollah. In 2006, during the summer of 2006, a war opposed Israel to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hezbollah being one of the political groups, the political organization of the Shia population in Lebanon. So a never-ending series of armed confrontations opposing the Israeli to the Palestinians on the one hand, the Israeli to various Arab units, basically states, but not necessarily in the case of Hezbollah. On the other hand, how then can we account or try to account for this reality? At first sight, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot but think of Thomas Hobbes' state of war concept. In his Leviathan, you know that Thomas Hobbes coined the concept of a state of war, which is the attitude characterized when the attitude of the different political units consists in a disposition to go to war. That is to say, when, I quote, political units are in the attitude of gladiators, their weapons, their eyes pointing on one another, when they have their frontiers armed, their cannons planted against their neighbors round about. The concept of state of war, to put it differently, is synonymous with a never-ending enmity, a never-ending hostility. At first sight, I said, this concept seems to perfectly describe the reality of Israeli-Palestinian Arab relationships for more than 70 years now, and yet there is, or at least there was, a glimmer of hope in this fairly tragic picture. In 1977, the then Egyptian leader, Anwar al-Sadat, what did he do? He went to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, to propose peace talks to Israel. And these peace talks indeed eventually ended up in an effective peace agreement signed in the US at Camp David. The Camp David agreement. Camp David is the summer residence of American presidents. The then American president was Jimmy Carter. So why then was Egypt, after 4 bloody wars opposing Egypt to Israel, why was Egypt able, or why was Sadat able to take this initiative in order to get out of the state of war? And why, ladies and gentlemen, has this not yet maybe, but not been the case regarding the Palestinians, of whatever political, ideological, or religious obedience your generation, of course, does not know. You may know it, but you did not live it. You did not experience the 1970s, the 1980s, 1970s, 60s, when the Palestinian activists fighting against Israel were more or less influenced by a left-wing Marxist, at least a secular ideology. Islamic activists, grouped or not in the Hamas emerged at the very end of the 1980s. We come back to this. So whatever the religious, political, ideological obedience of the Palestinian activists, they are unable or refuse or cannot, we come back to this, get out of the state of war with Israel. So why then is this the case? The core question of this chapter is to try to understand why Egypt was able to get out of the state of war, and also Jordan, and why this has not been the case for the Palestinians. In order to do so, I think there is one theoretical framework that we can use, and this theoretical framework is Alexander Wendt's social theory of international politics. This constructivist, soft constructivist approach permits us to better understand the difference between the relationships between Israel and notably Egypt, to some extent Jordan. On the one hand, Israel, it is a mutual relationship, of course, to the Palestinians on the other hand. So Alexander Wendt's social theory of international politics, as indicated in the title, is a direct allusion to Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics. On the one hand, we have theory, and on the other hand, we have social theory of international politics. So they have a common point, of course, and they have a difference, or Alexander Wendt introduces a difference in his social theory of international politics, which he distinguishes from Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics. The common point is that both are interested in international politics, not international relations, but international politics, that is to say, in the traditional definition of international relations as first and foremost concerning relations among political units, and in our times among nation states, in the domain of war and peace, or to use Alexander Wendt's expression, in the domain of violence and the regulation of violence, in the domain of conflict and cooperation or security. Listen to Alexander Wendt. Regulating violence is one of the most fundamental problems of order in social life. To regulate violence is one of the most fundamental problems, because the nature of violent technology, who controls it and how it is used, deeply affect all other social relations. So to some extent, violence must be regulated in order for any kind of somehow normal life to be possible. That is, I quote, that is the aspect of world politics which I, Alexander Wendt, am interested in my book. So he is interested in violence and the regulation of violence. And therefore his approach is state-centric. Therefore his approach is state-centric. And here, ladies and gentlemen, a confusion, an error is pretty often committed, a mistake is pretty often committed, notably here in France, considering constructivism to be a non-state-centric approach. This is wrong. Constructivism is not non-state-centric. It's not necessarily state-centric either. Everything depends on the object of study, the topic that constructivists are interested in. Some are state-centric because they focus on states. Others are not state-centric because they focus on, for instance, on networks of any kind, on multinational firms, on individual actors, etc., etc. But Alexander Wendt is state-centric because he considers that violence and the regulation of violence, first and foremost, regards states. Listen to this. Since the state, page 8, the very beginning of his social theory of international politics, since the state is a structure of political authority with a monopoly of the legitimate use of organized violence, this is Max Weber's definition of the state, since the state possesses the monopoly on the legitimate use of organized violence, when it comes to the regulation of violence internationally, when it comes to the regulation of violence internationally, it is states one ultimately has to control. It is states one ultimately has to control. So the regulation of violence on the international scene regards first and foremost states. States, I go on, page 9, are still the primary medium through which the effects of other actors on the regulation of violence are channeled into the world system. States are still the most important actors when it comes to violence and the regulation of violence. In that sense, states are still at the center of the international system, and as such, it makes no sense. It makes no more sense to criticize a theory of international politics as state-centric than it does to criticize a theory of forests to be tree-centric. Just as he or she who is interested in forests cannot but look on trees, though there are more than merely trees in a forest, of course. The same is true for those who are interested in violence and the regulation in violence on the world political stage. They first and foremost must look at the states. So these are the two common points: international politics and not international relations, broadly defined, including transnational relations, etc., and state centrism. These are the two common points between Waltz and Wendt. Of course, Wendt, since he wants to criticize, since he wants to add a social theory, propose a social theory rather than mere theory, as had been put forward by Waltz, he must agree upon the starting points. You cannot criticize somebody if you do not have the same starting point. Otherwise, it is a dialogue of the deaf. So they share the same point, but of course, since Wendt wants to introduce new elements, since he wants to innovate by criticizing Kenneth Waltz's conception, there are also differences. And the difference is that, according to Alexander Wendt, the Waltzian, that is to say realist or neo-realist conception of anarchy, as necessarily implying the self-help behavior of states because of the absence of any authority above states, this meaning of anarchy is not the only one. Anarchy is likely to be different depending on a state's behavior, depending on a state's identity. And this then is the specific contribution of constructivists, in this case, more specifically, soft constructivists, such as Alexander Wendt. If we want to understand how states behave, we have to look at their identity and not at their interest, as is the case for rationalist theorists, be they realist or be they liberals. Liberals also claim that the state is looking for its interest, the economic well-being interest of its population. Realists claim that states are also driven by their national interest. This national interest may be offensive power or defensive security. For Morgenthau, it's power. States are looking for more and more power. He's an offensive classical realist. Kenneth Waltz is a defensive neo-realist. States, first and foremost, look and must look and do look for security, not for power, but for security. Power is a mere means to an end. The end is security. So rationalist theorists, be they realists or liberals, explain a state's behavior by its interest. Constructivists, such as Alexander Wendt, and more specifically soft constructivists, therefore, explain a state's behavior or a collective unit's behavior by its identity. It is the identity which shapes actually the interest. So listen to Alexander Wendt. He accepts that the state acts on the basis of its national interest, but this national interest is shaped by, embedded in a state's identity or a state's identities, because there may be more than one singular particular identity, just as therefore there can be more than one singular interest or national interest. Listen to Alexander Wendt. No one denies that states act on the basis of their perceived interests, the way they perceive their interests. No one would deny that, and few would deny that those interests are often egoistic. Most of the time, states act egoistically. So he shares here one more point with Kenneth Waltz. I do not deny that. To that extent, page 113, 114 of his social theory of international politics, I do not deny that. To that extent, I'm a realist. To that extent, I'm a realist. So he shares one more common starting point, but he immediately makes clear the difference. Interests should not be seen as an exclusively realist variable. Interests should not be seen as an exclusive realist variable. Why? For two major reasons. First of all, because a state's interests do not depend on the objective distribution of material capabilities, the resources compared to other states' resources, the richness compared to other states' richness. No, a state's interests depend on a state's identities. Identities. What is a state identity? And there are many identities depending on the different domains, the different sectors of international politics. An identity, the identity of a state is defined as the set of ideas states have of themselves, the way they do perceive themselves and their place, their role, their rank on the international scene. And of course, this identity also depends on what other states think of the first state. In other words, identities are shared, are mutually shared, are not subjective, but intersubjective. This explains that Alexander Wendt's theory is a social and not a psychological theory of international politics. The perception that states have of themselves depends also on the perception that other states have of itself, and reciprocally. So it is a socially constructed, mutually shared conception, not a purely subjective perception, as is the case in psychological approaches or cognitive approaches. Listen to Alexander Wendt. Identities refer to who actors are. Interests refer to what actors want. Interests presuppose identities. An actor cannot know what it wants if it does not know who he or she is. And this is the reason why constructivism is a social theory, a social science theory, and not a specific international relations theory. It is a social science theory applied by Wendt to the analysis of international relations and more specifically to international politics. Identities of states are exactly for states, but identities are for average people, such as you and me. In our everyday life, ladies and gentlemen, we have different identities depending on how we perceive our relations with other people and how they perceive their relations with us, and how this mutually shared perception contributes to construct our behavior, our interactions, our mutual relations. Take the example, and this is the example that is given by Alexander Wendt himself, and this is the reason why I feel free to use it. Take the example of a professor. Sorry for this. Take the example of a professor. A professor is a professor only in his or her relations with students. In the academic setting of a university, a professor, when driving his car, is not a professor. He's a car driver. And if he goes through a red light, it is absolutely useless to tell the policeman who is about to punish by a fine this behavior. It is absolutely useless to tell the policeman, I'm a professor. This will not work. The policeman will make fun of the professor claiming he's a professor, since what he did when going through the red light has absolutely no relation with his identity as a professor, which is only valid when dealing with his or her students during his class, when looking at the papers written by the students, etc., etc. So the social context explains what identities very concretely are consisting in. And therefore, in the domain of international politics, I come back to our topic here. What states believe of themselves and of the other states, and what other states believe of the first state and of their relations with it, and how states act and react on the basis of these shared, mutually shared perceptions, according to Alexander Wendt, these actions and these reactions, these perceptions and these mutually shared perceptions are likely to change depending on the context and to evolve over time, which amounts to saying that anarchy actually is not a structure. At least it is not a material structure, it is a cultural structure. Anarchies are cultures, and I say anarchies and not anarchy because there are more than one single anarchical cultures. There are more than one culture. There are more than one set of shared beliefs, of shared perceptions, of shared beliefs shaping the mutual perceptions and therefore determining the concrete behavior, which is embedded in these in the sets of shared perceptions by the different states regarding the way they perceive themselves, the way they perceive the other ones, their role and rank and place on the international scene. More specifically, according to Alexander Wendt, there are three types of anarchies, three cultures of anarchy, three anarchical cultures, three sets of beliefs that shape a state's behavior. First of all, and these are the three concepts he puts forward, the typology. First of all, an anarchy can be a Hobbesian cultural anarchy, a Hobbesian culture, a Hobbesian type of anarchy which prevails when states or collective units do perceive each other mutually as enemies. The second type of anarchy is the Lockean culture. The Lockean culture. Lockean culture, according to Alexander Wendt, prevails when states do perceive each other and act accordingly as rivals. And last but not least, according to Alexander Wendt, there is a third culture, the Kantian culture, which exists if and as long as states or collective units do perceive each other and act accordingly as friends. Hobbesian, Lockean, Kantian, of course, Wendt here refers to the way Thomas Hobbes and then John Locke and then Immanuel Kant interpreted in their writings of the 17th and 18th century, the way they interpreted the international political relations that they were analyzing in their philosophical essays. These three types of anarchy, according to Alexander Wendt, are likely to be internalized to three different degrees. States internalize more or less to the first, second, or third degree these different beliefs, these different mutually shared perceptions. And when they act, then they act either spontaneously or somehow forced or somehow by interests. So the three types of degrees to which the three types of anarchy are likely to be internalized are the following ones. To the first degree, a state shares a culture and acts accordingly, shares a kind of set of shared beliefs, mutually shared beliefs, and acts accordingly because the state cannot but do so. It is somehow forced to do so by stronger states who impose these beliefs, who impose these ways of acting. A state can also internalize the anarchical culture to the second degree. To the second degree, states share. I will give you concrete examples, of course, to permit you to better understand. States share culture and act accordingly because they are smart enough to understand that it is in their interest to do so. And to the third degree, states do share a culture because they indeed consider this culture to be legitimate. They have internalized as the normal way to act, and they do not even conceive of possibly acting differently. An example in our everyday life, ladies and gentlemen, the example of car drivers arriving at a red light. When you arrive with your car at a red light, you stop most of the time, I hope so. You stop first because you are forced to do so since there is another car coming at the crossroads, arriving at the crossroads. If you do not stop, you will have a car crash. So you run risks. In order to avoid this, you cannot but. So you somehow feel forced. You can't stop at the red light because you are forced to do so in order to avoid the car crash. But you can also decide to stop at the red light because you consider the possibility of a policeman punishing your behavior if you go through it. So you act on the basis of your interest, financial interest. You are smart enough to understand that it would be foolish for you to risk having to pay a fine if you go through the red light. And then the third most probable explanation of why you stop your car when you arrive at the red light is that, well, it is normal to stop when you arrive at the red light. You don't even think of, is there a car coming at the same time at the crossroads? Is there a policeman likely to punish your behavior? No, you spontaneously, automatically stop your car. Why? Because you have internalized as a legitimate way of stopping your car when arriving at the light, which is red, rather than green. The same is true for international politics. States do act on the basis of cultures, which sometimes, most of the time actually, they have internalized as normal, though sometimes they act on the basis of these beliefs that they have internalized either to the first or at best to the second degree. So let's come back to the three types of anarchies to give concrete historical examples, and then we will apply them to our case study, the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict. According to Alexander Wendt, the Hobbesian anarchy, which prevails when states do perceive each other as enemies and act accordingly. The Hobbesian anarchy exists when states are enemies. That is to say, enemies are adversaries who threaten each other and who do not limit their violence toward each other, which amounts to saying that they do deny the other's right, and this is shared. Two enemies do deny each other's right to exist as independent units, and they do not willingly limit the resort to violence when dealing with one another. According to Alexander Wendt, this Hobbesian anarchy prevailed in the past during antiquity, during the Middle Ages, as proven, according to him, by the fact that only the strong units survived empires. Empires were made by one political unit which gradually conquered all the neighboring entities. The stronger unit survived, killed the other one, refused its right to exist. Offensive power politics, in other words, was the then normal behavior. It was normal to behave this way. Everybody expected everybody else to use violence, so there was a never-ending violence. When both survived, their relations, during their encounter, their relations were guided by the enmity principle. Historical examples are very numerous. The Egyptians and the Assyrians, the Greeks versus the Persian barbarians, the Romans versus the Germanic barbarians, the Chinese versus the Mongols, and vice versa, of course. The Christians versus the Muslims in Spain during the Crusades, the Spanish conquistadores versus the Aztecs, the Incas in Latin America, etc., etc. And it was normal for all these units to act the way they acted. As proven, they had internalized to the third degree this Hobbesian anarchy, this Hobbesian culture. And the proof, according to Alexander Wendt, can be found in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War during the famous Melian dialogue. The Melian dialogue is the dialogue of the generals of the army of Athens entering the city-state of Melos, which they were about to destroy. So they decided to meet the delegates of the city of Melos, to which the Athenian army's generals said the following, quote, "You know as well as we do. You know as well as we do. It is a shared knowledge. It is a mutually shared internalized belief. You know as well as we do that the strong have the power to do what they want, and the weak have to accept. And the weak accept what they have to accept." I repeat, sorry for the hesitation. According to this dialogue, the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can, the weak accept what they must. Might is right in this Hobbesian anarchy, which prevailed throughout the ancient times and the Middle Ages. It prevailed until the 30 Years' War, until the Westphalian treaties, according to Alexander Wendt, we'll come back to this, when the Lockean anarchy emerged and gradually spread. That said, since 1648, since the Westphalian treaties, according to Alexander Wendt, this Hobbesian anarchy nevertheless survived temporarily at the systemic level, and it goes on surviving in some regional settings, in some local regions. Regarding the survival, the temporary re-emergence of this Hobbesian conception of international politics, Alexander Wendt gives the example of the Napoleonic Wars and of World War II. Because of Napoleon's behavior, because of Hitler's behavior. What had Napoleon and Hitler in common? They wanted to create an empire. L'Empire, Napoleon, das Dritte Reich, regarding Hitler. By doing so, by integrating into the French and the Third Reich, the Third Empire, the non-German, the non-French populations, Napoleon and then Hitler denied these other political units the right to exist. Therefore, this period, due to Napoleon's and to Hitler's behavior, were two Hobbesian moments. This Hobbesian anarchy, however, at that time, also because of the behavior of the British and the Russians and the Austrians fighting against Napoleon, and the British and the Americans and the Soviets fighting against Hitler. This Hobbesian moment, however, was merely internalized to the first degree. The Americans, the Soviets, the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians could not but adopt a Hobbesian anarchy to get rid of Napoleon, to get rid of Hitler. It was not internalized by them as a normal behavior, but they could not but adopt this same violent behavior and to force Napoleon and Hitler to capitulate without any condition in order to survive themselves. And once Napoleon and Hitler were defeated, the Hobbesian culture was automatically abandoned, which means that it had been internalized only to the first degree. They could not but behave the way they behave in order to cope with the Napoleonic and Hitler Hobbesian behavior. And regarding the second exception, contemporary re-emergence or contemporary survival of Hobbesian anarchy in specific geographically delimited regions, well, the example given by Alexander Wendt precisely is the Israeli-Arab conflict. or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because, according to Alexander Wendt, the book was written in 1999. Peace at that time was, and I can add nowadays, still is impossible. Israel and Palestinians, and in 1999, the Arab states, the majority of them at least, denied each other's right to exist, did not recognize the other's right to be sovereign political entities. We come back, of course, to this last example, since it is precisely our case study. So Hobbesian anarchy prevailed in the past, up to 1648, when the Lockean anarchy emerged and gradually triumphed. The Lockean anarchy is an anarchy composed by rivals. States that are rivals do recognize each other's right to exist. However, this does not mean that they do not go to war against each other. But the war that they may fight against each other is a limited one. It is not a war aiming at destruction, at annihilation. It is a war just in order, notably, to settle a dispute, and pretty often a border quarrel among the two states, when there is a disagreement regarding the territory upon which the different states' sovereignty should be exerted. So according to Alexander Wendt, after the Westphalian treaties, we could say in the Westphalian system that has been prevailing since 1648 and still goes on nowadays, the Lockean anarchy is prevailing. States do spontaneously, it is internalized to the third degree, do spontaneously recognize each other's right to exist. And it is internalized to the third degree because states do not ask the question, should I or should I not invade my neighbor? This question is no longer asked. The states do not undertake a rational cost advantage calculation. Is it in my interest to attack my neighbor or not? Will there be a punishment if I do attack my neighbor? No, they just do not even consider that attacking the neighbor could exist, could be a possibility. So violence exists, goes on existing, but if it breaks out, it will necessarily be limited. Rivals within the Lockean anarchy stop short from destroying, eliminating each other. A very concrete example to permit you to understand the difference between the Hobbesian and the Lockean behavior: Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein came to power in 1978. In 1980, what did he do? He attacked Iran. He attacked Iran to do what? To change the border along the Shatt-al-Arab River. He wanted to change the border in order to grasp some territories that were Iranian territories, also for a very concrete reason, the oil fields that he wanted to conquer in order to increase the economic wealth, the economic riches of Iraq. But he did not want to eliminate Iran. Probably he was smart enough to understand that he was unable to do so, that he would be unable to destroy Iran. But anyway, the war was limited. It was a Lockean behavior. In 1990, however, Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, occupied Kuwait, and annexed Kuwait as an Iraqi province. That is to say, he denied the right of Kuwait to exist as a sovereign unit. In doing so, he adopted a Hobbesian behavior. You know that this invasion of Kuwait by Iraq provoked the intervention, thanks to a UN resolution, of the US and its allies, staging Operation Desert Storm to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw and to permit Kuwait to recover its sovereignty. This Operation Desert Storm, therefore, was a Lockean undertaking. It was aiming at re-establishing the violated sovereignty norm, violated by Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait. And once Saddam Hussein pushed back into Iraq, the war stopped. Saddam Hussein was not overthrown. This is what will happen in 2003. Therefore, Operation Iraqi Freedom, staged by George Bush, the son, Jr., George Walker Bush, yes, George W. Bush. This Operation Iraqi Freedom was a Hobbesian undertaking. It was a Hobbesian undertaking because the aim of the US was to deny, not necessarily the independence of Iraq, but to deny Iraq's right to self-determination, to establish its own government, since the new government was established by the US after its victory, military victory, in operation, thanks to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And you know that Iraq was attacked without any UN resolution, so regarding international law, also it was a Hobbesian and not a Lockean undertaking. So these very concrete examples, I gave you a concrete example of what the Kantian anarchy is, what the Kantian anarchy when dealing with NATO. NATO is an example of a Kantian anarchy, that is to say, of a group of states that actually are friends because they help each other when one of them is threatened, and they do not even conceive of going to war against each other. There is no other example of a Kantian anarchy, according to Alexander Wendt. This third type of anarchy, the Kantian anarchy, is not applicable to our case study. So let's then come to our case study. Let's apply Alexander Wendt's framework to our Israeli-Arab and to our Israeli-Palestinian relationship. Let's start with the relationship between Israel and Egypt. 4 wars opposed the two states, 48, 56, 67, 73. And then what did Anwar al-Sadat do in 1977? He decided to go to the Knesset, to the Israeli parliament, to do what? To propose peace talks. And this offer, this proposal, indeed permitted peace, a peace treaty to be signed in 1979 at Camp David, thanks to the then American President Jimmy Carter, who have an idea of Sadat's shift from the Hobbesian logic, we do not recognize Israelis' right to exist, to a Lockean one, because by going to Jerusalem, to the Knesset, he indirectly acknowledged Israel's right to exist, of course. To have an idea, let's have a detailed look, ladies and gentlemen, on Sadat's speech that he held at the Knesset. You will see very concretely what the Lockean anarchy is all about. It's document number 3 in the file onward. I quote, in details, this important speech, Sadat, I do not blame all those who received my decision with surprise and even amazement. Yes, it was an amazing decision. No one could ever have conceived that the president of the biggest Arab state, demographically speaking, Egypt is the most important, was and still is the most important Arab state. No one could ever have conceived that the president of the biggest Arab state, which bears the heaviest burden, bears the present in 1977. And the main responsibility pertaining to the cause of war and peace in the Middle East, nobody could have conceived that this biggest Arab state should declare his readiness to go to the land of the adversary while we were still in a state of war. So he uses very explicitly Thomas Hobbes's expression, the state of war. We, Egypt, are in a state of war with Israel, and therefore everybody is surprised by my decision, so that's decision, to go to the land of the adversary, the Knesset. We all still bear the consequences of 4 fierce wars waged within 30 years, less than 40 years, from 48 to 73. I go on quoting, Sadat, took this decision after long thought, knowing that it constitutes a great risk, It was indeed a risky behavior. He himself paid with his life. He was killed in 1981 by a member of his presidential guard. I took this decision after a long thought to save my Egyptian Arab people and the pan-Arab nation from the horrors of new suffering and destructive wars. I don't want any war anymore. I want to save my people and the pan-Arab nations. At that time, the prevailing ideology was the secular pan-Arabic ideology. That is to say, different Arab states claimed, sincerely or not, that beyond their division in different Arab states, there was a pan-Arab nation. And there were some attempts of these different Arab states constituting only one unity between Egypt and Syria, with Libya, etc. But to some extent, it was more discourse, as pretty often in politics, than reality. Anyway, he goes on. If I said that I wanted to avert from all the Arab people the horrors of shocking, destructive wars, and here he starts his direct proposal to the Israelis. I must sincerely declare that I have the same feelings and I bear the same responsibility towards all and every man on earth, not merely to the Arabs, but to everybody, and certainly towards the Israeli people. I don't want the Israeli people to suffer in the future from new and destructive wars. Any life that is lost in war is a human life, be it an Arab or an Israeli life. A wife who becomes a widow is a human being entitled to a happy family life, be she an Arab or an Israeli, an Arab or an Israeli. Every person, every wife deserves to live in peace, be he or she Israeli or Arab. How then can we achieve permanent peace based on justice? Before I proclaim my answer, he puts forward a preliminary remark. I wish to assure you that in my clear and frank answer, I'm availing the call for permanent just peace based on the respect of United Nations resolutions. He refers to UN resolutions. Now, Israel is a member of the UN. By referring to UN resolutions, he indirectly acknowledges the right of Israel to be a state, since Israel is a full member of the United Nations. A first indirect step to recognizing Israel's right to exist. How can we, he goes on, concretely thinking of how peace can be made, how can we achieve permanent peace? How can we achieve a durable peace based on justice? The answer is neither difficult nor impossible. Despite long years of blood, faction, strife, hatreds, animosity, you want to live with us in this part of the world, I tell you, we welcome you. You want to live with us, and I do welcome you among us with security and safety. And then he emphasizes the distinction of the past when compared to what he now is proposing. We used to reject you. We refused to meet you. We used to set up a lot of preconditions before meeting you. This has happened, yet, and here's the difference, here's the change, here's the progress, the change from a Hobbesian to a Lockean anarchy. Yet today I tell you that we accept to live with you in permanent peace. We accept to live with you. We no longer want to destroy you, which amounts to saying that we do recognize that you have the right to exist just as we have the right to exist. What is peace for Israel? It means that Israel lives in the region with her Arab neighbors in security and safety. Is this logical? I say yes. It means that Israel lives within its borders, secure against any aggression. Is that logical? I say yes. It means that Israel obtains all kinds of guarantees. I say yes. We declare that we accept all the international guarantees that you accept. So it is a reciprocal acceptance. We declare that we accept all the guarantees you want. Once again, I declare clearly and unequivocally that we agree to any guarantees you accept, because in return, we shall receive the same guarantees. You have the guarantee to live in peace because you guarantee our peace, and reciprocally. So here we have exactly the shift from a Hobbesian to a Lockean culture. Why then? This is the question I feel free to ask. Was Sadat able to do so, to change? Why could he afford to drop the past Hobbesian logic to adopt the new Lockean logic, to concretely travel to the Knesset and make this proposal? Well, the answer is the following, ladies and gentlemen: because Egypt's own existence was not at stake in its opposition to Israel. Egypt had fought 4 wars against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians, on behalf of the Palestinian cause, if we can call it. And what was the result? It lost a part of its territory. It lost the Sinai Peninsula, which in 1977 was still occupied by the Israeli. So Israel had conquered a part of Egypt's territory, but Israel never denied Egypt's right to exist. So once a more rational leader, if we can use this term, Sadat, rather than somehow revolutionary Nasser, came to power, once a rational leader came to the conclusion, my support of the Palestinian cause had as result the loss of a part of my territory, once a rational leader makes a cost advantage calculation, he of course comes to the conclusion that it is irrational to go on living in the never-ending state of war. And so he could indeed make the step consisting in proposing peace. Once he dropped the illusion of a pan-Arab unity necessary for the Palestinians to obtain what they were looking for, etc. Once he was acting as a statesman, guided by national interests, in the term of the territorial integrity of Egypt, he logically came to the conclusion that he had to accept Israel's existence, which was not difficult since Israel never had denied the existence of Egypt. And since 1977, when at Camp David, the Israelis and Egyptians signed the peace treaty, new Arab states came to the same conclusion. It was true for Jordan in 1994, and very recently, it has been the case also for the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain, who normalized their relation. In this latter case, of course, the fact that both states, have a look at document number 4, have as a common enemy Iran, and the fact that Trump, of course, their most important common ally of the United Arab Emirates and of Bahrain on the one hand, and of Israel on the other hand, explains the normalization of these relations. You also know that Trump announced 1 or 2 weeks ago that Sudan will also very soon recognize Israel's existence. So Egypt, I will focus on Egypt, the most important state here, could adopt a Lockean anarchy, a Lockean culture, because Israel, when dealing with Egypt, of course, also shares this Lockean culture. And we come to the Palestinians, you understand immediately that what is true for the Israeli-Egyptian relationship cannot be true, or at least has not yet been true for the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. I would like to start with a statement put forward by David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel as an independent state, who in 1936, when the first significant number of Jewish settlers arrived in the then British mandatory territory called Palestine, this is what David Ben-Gurion said, and it perfectly sums up the roots of the conflict which is going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Us and them want the same thing. Us and them want the same thing. Us and them want the same land, the same territory we call Israel, and the Palestinians call Palestine. This statement perfectly sums up the root of the conflict, because it is as such likely to be read through Hobbes's looking glasses. Listen to Hobbes, Wendt to men, in this case, two political units, desire the same thing, in this case, the same land, which they cannot both enjoy. When two actors want the same thing they cannot both enjoy simultaneously, they become enemies. Thomas Hobbes, 1651. They become enemies. In the way to their end, they endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. Thomas Hobbes' description of the state of war perfectly corresponds to the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. When two units desire the same land, they cannot both enjoy. They become enemies. So the enmity broke out very concretely or very manifestly and no longer latently in 1948 when Israel proclaimed its creation, when it managed to survive the attack by the Arab neighbors, because by becoming a sovereign state, it denied automatically, mechanically, the right of the Palestinians to have their sovereign unit. And therefore, ever since then, the Palestinians, or at least the Palestinian activists, want to destroy Israel in order to have what they are looking for too, and they cannot enjoy, since Israel is enjoying it, the land they call Palestine. So what did they very concretely do? They adopted the PLO covenants. Document number 2 in the file, listen to this. Article 1, Palestine is the homeland of the Arab-Palestinian people. It is the homeland of the Arab-Palestinian people, which means it's not the homeland of anyone else, and in this case of Jews. Article 9, armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. Armed struggle, we will not talk, we just resort to violence. Article 19, the partition of Palestine in 1947, the partition plan of the UN, you have the map in the file. Partition plan of Palestine in 1947 and the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948 are illegal, regardless of the passage of time. Law cannot legitimate the existence of Israel. Article 20, Judaism being a religion and not an independent nationality, Jews do not constitute a single nation. They are citizens of the states to which they belong. So Jews are French in France, and they will be Palestinians in the future Palestine, because there can be no Israel. Article 22, the liberation of Palestine will destroy the Hobbesian anarchy, annihilation, elimination, destruction, will destroy the Zionist and imperialist presence. Imperialist presence is a typical third world, left-wing, Marxist third world expression of the 1960s. So very concretely, we saw this at the beginning. What did the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its different organization members do? They staged various attacks from Jordan first, then after being expelled during what they called Black September from South Lebanon, Israeli counterattack in 1982. Arafat, their leader, was expelled. He went to he was forced and saved by the French. A French ship took him to Tunis. The first Intifada broke out in 1987. The first uprising broke out. And since Arafat was 2,000-3,000 kilometers west of the front, the military front from the Palestinian perspectives, he was looking for another solution. He was trying to re-become a kind of important actor in the Palestinian-Israeli opposition. So what did he do? He was invited to and accepted to go to the UN, no more in New York. He had been at the UN in New York City in 1975, and he arrived at the tribune of the UN with a gun in his belt, which shocked, of course, but he also had a peace symbol in the other hand. Anyway, it was a fairly shocking attitude, so the Americans refused to give him a visa in order to permit him to come back. So he went to Geneva. On December 13, 1988, so roughly 1 year after the start of the first Intifada, this is what I said. He adopted a speech very similar to Sadat's speech. That is to say, he adopted a Lockean approach document number 5. Listen to Arafat. The PLO will seek a comprehensive settlement. Among the parties concerned by the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the state of Palestine, because he considers, he posits that there must be a state which did not exist, which does not exist yet, 2 years later. The PLO will seek a comprehensive settlement among the parties, including the state of Palestine, Israel, and other neighbors. So we accept a peace settlement with Israel, which indirectly means that Israel is recognized by the PLO. On the basis of resolutions 242 and 338 of the UN, those resolutions that had condemned the territorial occupations by Israel of the Sinai Peninsula, but this problem had been resolved thanks to the peace treaty of the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and of the West Bank, of course, and the eastern part of Jerusalem. I asked the leaders, and here then he directly addresses himself to Israelis, just as Sadat had done, but he does this in Geneva at the UN, not at the Knesset, of course. I asked the leaders of Israel to come here under the sponsorship of the UN, so that together we can forge peace. Let's create peace together. I say to them that our people who wants dignity, freedom, and peace and security wants the same for all the states. For all the states, which includes Israel implicitly and then explicitly, he integrates Israel. I would address myself specifically to the Israeli people, especially to the advocates of democracy and freedom among them. I say to them, come, let us make peace. So he proposes peace. Cast away fear and intimidation. Leave behind the specter of wars, the state of war that used to characterize our relationships. For the past 40 years, set aside all threats of wars to come. Let us make peace. Let us make the peace of the bold, la paix des braves. Let us make the peace of the bold. This, ladies and gentlemen, as far as I know, was the first official statement of Palestinians, of whatever obedience, recognizing Israel's right to exist. The problem, however, was that the then PLO Charter was still existing, and the PLO Charter, which we referred to some minutes ago, calls to the destruction, calls the Palestinians, appeals to the Palestinians destroying Israel. So when he came to France in 1989, during the different summits preparing the 200 years, the celebration of the French Revolution, to which Mitterrand invited all the major world leaders. So he also invited Arafat. And Arafat was asked, I remember, by French journalists, well, you claim that you want peace with Israel, but you go on in your charter proclaiming that armed struggle is the only way to achieve peace, etc. You want to destroy Israel. This was Arafat's response to the journalists. The PLO charter, he said, is caduc in French, null and void. It's no longer our guide in our relations with Israel. So he made a first step towards peace. And this step created a kind of virtuous spiral, thanks to the Gulf War, which started in 1990. 1991, the Americans intervened to stop Saddam Hussein, to force him to withdraw from Kuwait. And the Americans saw that Saddam Hussein, to some extent, was a hero for what, at that time and still nowadays, is called the Arab Street. That is to say, majority of Arab populations were somehow favorable to Saddam Hussein much more than to Kuwait. And the Americans came then, George Bush the father, came to the conclusion, we must do something in order to change this perception of the US. We must progress towards the Israeli-Palestinian settlement. So what did the Americans do? And here we come back to Alexander Wendt's enemies, Hobbesian enemies, do not willingly stop their violence. So there must be a third party that invites them. Who invites them? So what did the Americans do? They organized the Madrid conference, where diplomats from Israel and diplomats from the PLO met to try to find a solution. They found no solution, but a peace agreement nevertheless was signed a little bit later in 1994 in Oslo. Oslo, the neutral status of Norway permitted progress. The Oslo agreements were signed in 1994. And Arafat's PLO officially recognized Israel's right to exist. This, in Oslo agreements, earned Arafat, as well as Rabin, the then Israeli Prime Minister, and Shimon Peres, the then Israeli Secretary of State, the Peace Nobel Prize. At that time, I remember there was a very credible, optimistic belief that peace would at last prevail in the Middle East. But this optimistic outlook lasted 1 year or so, because in 1995, the first Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was killed. He was killed by a Jewish extremist, just as Sadat had been killed by an Islamic extremist in 1981. Rabin will be killed by a Jewish extremist opposed to the peace. And ever since then, in Israel, the right-wing political parties are governing. And this shift in Israel is parallel to a somehow similar shift among Palestinians, where the secular left-wing PLO was gradually bypassed by the extremist Islamic Hamas. Hamas was created in 1988, the year of Arafat's shift towards a Lockean perception. Hamas was created during the first Intifada, when the PLO, the secular PLO's headquarters were in Tunis. So the Islamic revival, which occurred in the rest of the Muslim world from Iran 79 to Algeria at the beginning of the 90s, etc., in Turkey nowadays, this Islamic revival also occurred among the Palestinian populations in Gaza, mostly to some extent in the West Bank, but above all in Gaza. And Hamas adopted in 1988 its own covenant, its own charter, which, document number 6, is a definitely Hobbesian charter. Look at the charter and listen to these quotes in the preamble. This is what the Hamas says: Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it. So we, Hamas, will destroy Israel. Article 13, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Jihad, the holy armed struggle, replaced the armed struggle of the secular PLO of the 1960s. Article 28, Israel, Judaism, and Jews challenge Islam and the Muslim people. May the cowards never sleep. The cowards. The cowards. This is the term used by the Hamas. Netanyahu, at the beginning of this chapter, this lecture, I quoted him, used the term animals. So you see that the protagonists of both camps do deny the other's right to be human beings. They do not perceive them as human beings. They perceive them as cowards. They perceive them as animals. As long as such a perception will prevail, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that no peace is likely to triumph. Article 35, the Islamic resistance movement is composed of soldiers. Remaron considers foreign policy of a unit to be what he calls the diplomatic strategic conduct. The diplomatic strategic conduct, that is to say, the diplomat as well as the soldier personify the states on the international scene. Diplomat who talks on behalf of the state, who negotiates, who looks for compromises, who accepts a dialogue, and the soldier who uses his gun to kill the other, the enemy, the adversary, the rival. There is no diplomat in Hamas. There are only soldiers. The Hamas resistance movement, the Islamic resistance movement, is composed of soldiers. So this charter, ladies and gentlemen, which still is valid now, confirms, I'm afraid, that for more than 70 years now, any attempt to get out of the Hobbesian state of war opposing the Israeli to the Palestinians, any attempt is doomed to failure, is rejected by what Alexander Wendt calls Israeli and Palestinian fundamentalists. This is what he wrote in 1999, 4 years after Rabin being killed by a Jewish fundamentalist. And obviously, I'm afraid this is true if we listen to the reaction of the Fatah, that is to say, the most important part of the PLO, which nowadays governs, rules the West Bank, after the decision of Israel to go on with its settlements. The Fatah joins the Hamas with the same condemnation of Israel's behavior. Listen to the secretary of the Fatah movement.
We will not surrender. We will not give up. All the options are open if we reach the situation that the Israelis start the annexation and slamming the door for the two-state solution.
So the Fatah joins the Hamas in rejecting, of course, Israel's plans of annexation. Israel plans to annex the West Bank, or significant part of the West Bank, which means that it denies the right of the Palestinians to have their own entity. In other words, nothing changed during the last 70 years in the mutual perception of the Palestinians and the Israelis. According to Alexander Wendt, the fundamentalist Palestinians, the fundamentalist Israelis, I'm afraid that it's worse than that. I'm afraid that it is worse than that. Why? Because if such a mutual perception prevails during three generations, it's not a question of fundamentals. It is probably rooted in population. It is rooted in the majority of average and not fundamentalist Palestinians and Israeli, or at least the majority of the citizens of both units are not opposed to their fundamentalists. They do not try to get rid of their fundamentalists. And as long as this is the case, no progress, I'm afraid, is likely. Towards peace, no progress to peace is likely to be prevailing in a more or less faraway future. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to today's lecture. Have a great day, nevertheless, and I hope you'll be back next week. Goodbye.